What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Let's continue our conversation with 100 years of world championship fights. Now, Johnny Dundee is to your left, and Johnny Kilbane is to your right. Dundee was 18, and Kilbane was the featherweight champion of the world. This fight took place in Vernon, California. It was a 20-round draw. And although Dundee would take the fight to Johnny Kilbane, the crowd couldn't believe what they were watching. And Kilbane would never give Dundee another opportunity until Dundee was 28 years of age. Dundee would fight February 2nd, 1923, against a young man by the name of Alino Flores, 15 rounds. Now, the fight with Kilbane was April 29th, 1913, and he wouldn't get that opportunity until February 2nd, 1923, against Flores. But that was only recognition of featherweight champion. It wasn't until July 26, 1923, when he would defeat the world reigning champion, Eugene Creek, and now be considered the world featherweight champion. What a story. Johnny Dundee, known as the Scotch Wop, one of the greatest rope dancers in boxing history. We'll be continuing the career of Johnny Dundee as this series goes on. January 23rd, 1915, middleweight Jeff Smith defeats Les Darcy in a 5-round disqualification. Sydney, Australia. It's for the Australian version of the middleweight championship belt. Now, who was Jeff Smith? His name was Jerome Jeffords. They called him the Bayonne Globetrotter. He was born April 23rd, 1891 in Brooklyn, New York. And he would resign to Harlem, New York. Harlem, New York was in Manhattan. And it would be there when he would meet Johnny Wilson. Johnny Wilson would become middleweight champion when he defeated Mike O'Dowd in 1920. And in 1923, he would lose his crown to the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. Jeff Smith died May 3rd, 1962. He was 70 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Levittown, New Jersey. He stood 5 foot 8.5 inches. He had a 71-inch reach. He was a middleweight with a total bout career of 106 fights, 88 wins, 12 losses, 48 by the knockout route. And he'd be stopped 3 times with 3 draws. Now, his opponent was Les Darcy. His name was James Leslie Darcy. He was known as the Maitland Wonder. He was born October 31st, 1895 in Scrapbook Island. He died May 24th, 1917, Scrapbook Island. That would be in Queensland, Australia. He stood 5 foot 6 inches. He had a 71-inch reach. He was a middleweight who fought from 1910 to 1916. Had a total bout career of 50 fights, 46 wins, 4 losses, 29 by the knockout route, with 4 draws. He defeated George Chipp, who was a middleweight champion of the world. Matter of fact, George Chipp would defeat Frank Klaus for that title. Would also fight Eddie McCarthy, very good fighter, wound up becoming a champion. George K.O. Brown. January 23rd, 1915, he would lose in a disqualification in 5 rounds to Jeff Smith for the Australian version of the World Middleweight Championship belt. May 22nd, 1915, he would win and reverse that decision, disqualification, for the World Australian version of the middleweight championship belt. Now, what does that mean? Australian version. That means he was the Australian recognition of the middleweight championship belt. That's basically what that means. And it's Australia, 2nd round knockout. Incredible. January 23rd, Tansy Lee stops Jimmy Wilde in 17 rounds in London, England. He remains the British and European flyweight champion. Now, who was Jimmy Wilde? His name was Williams James Wilde. They called him the Mighty Atom. He was born May 12, 1892, in Quakers Yard, Wales, United Kingdom. He died March 10, 1969. He was 76 years of age at the time of his death. He would reside in Taylorstown in Wales. He stood 5 foot 2.5 inches, and he had a 66-inch reach. He was a flyweight champion with total bouts of 143 fights, 131 wins, 3 losses. He had 98 by the knockout route, and he was stopped 3 times. He had 1 draw. January 25th, 1915, he lost vacant run for the EBU, International Boxing Union National Sporting Club. It was a title that was held by Tansy Lee. Now, June 18th, 1923, he would lose to Pancho Villa, 7th round knockout, vicious punching combination. That would be towards the end of his career. But Jimmy Wilde, unbelievable fighter. We'll talk a little bit more about him and that fight with Pancho Villa as the series goes on. Saturday, February 20th. Saturday, February 20th. I don't know why I'm getting tongue-tied today. Oxnard Cyclone. Sam McVeigh defeats Battling Jim Johnson. 20 rounds. Cuba Havana. He defends his colored World Heavyweight Championship belt. Battling Jim Johnson. Born September 2nd, 1887. Danville, Virginia. He died November 6, 1918 in East Orange, New Jersey. He fought from 1909 to 1918. Stood 5 foot 9.5 inches and had a 76-inch reach. Had a total bout career of 50 fights. 25 wins, 17 losses, 25 by the knockout route, and he was stopped 17 times himself. He was in the ring with fighters such as Black Bill, Joe Jeanette, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Glos, Harry Wells, George Kid Cotton, Kid Norfolk. His name was William Ward, Sam McVeigh, and a Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford. Most of these men were all champions, either in the color division. March 26, welterweight and Jack Britton and Ted Kid Lewis begin a 20-bout series, 10 rounds with no decision in New York. Jack Britton, his name was William J. Brinslin, who was also known as the Boxing Marvel. Fought from 1904 to 1930. He was born October 14, 1885 in Clinton, New York. He died March 27, 1962 in Clinton, New York. Stood 5 foot 8 inches and had a 70-inch reach. Had a fighting career record of 157 bouts. 104 wins, 29 losses, 30 knockouts, and he was stopped only once. Ted Kid Lewis. His name was Gershon Midoff. He was born October 28th, 1893 in St. George, London. He died October 20th, 1970 in St. George, London. He stood 5 foot 7.5 inches and had a 69-inch reach. Total bout career of 237 extremely brilliant fights. Brilliant. Because in 1911, he would have 58 bouts in that 1 year alone. Incredible. Incredible. Unbelievable. 191 wins, 77 knockouts, 32 losses. He had 14 draws, and he was stopped 6 times. Being in the ring with Maxie Rosenblum, who would wind up becoming a light heavyweight champion. Charlie Ballinger, who would become a Canadian light heavyweight champion. He was the first fighter to wear the mouth guard, which they called the gum shields or gumshoes. I mean, I can't make this stuff up. We're looking at some dynamic fighters here. April 5th, Jess Willard knocks out heavyweight champion, the Galveston Giant, Jack Johnson. 26 rounds in Cuba Havana. Jack Johnson had claimed that he made a deal with the government to entertain the World Heavyweight Championship belt against Jess Willard. Jess Willard was from a circus, a carnival. No one took him serious. And Jack Johnson was just told, because he had already escaped the United States. He was away for 7 years. And he had stated that he wasn't coming back. The only fight he had up until that point was when battling Jim Johnson. And that was the first time a heavyweight championship belt was fought between 2 black fighters. The World Heavyweight Championship belt. And Jack Johnson has stated that the government told him that if he would fight Jess Willard, and if Jess Willard was to get the better of him, didn't necessarily have to win, but get the better of him, he would come back to the United States and not have to do jail time. That's the story of Jack Johnson. We'll get into that Jess Willard and Jack Johnson fight in more detail. Tuesday, April 13th, 35-year-old Joe Jeanette defeats 32-year-old Sam Langford, 12 rounds. Boston, Massachusetts. It was at the Athletic Club. Joe Jeanette becomes the colored World Heavyweight Champion. Referee Jack McGuivin would raise the hand of Joe Jeanette. So many years of hard work, sweat and tears. Joe Jeanette was a street fighter, had well over 100 fights in the street. Knocked men out near fire hydrants or cars or wherever they met. That's where he fought. He was knocking men out with one punch. Phenomenal fighter was Joe Jeanette. Tuesday, April 27th, 35-year-old Joe Jeanette and 30-year-old Sam McVeigh drew 12 rounds in Boston, Massachusetts. The Athletic Club. Joe Jeanette was 98-20 with 61 knockouts. He defeated Sam McVeigh. was in defense of his colored heavyweight championship belt. And he is Sam McVeigh. If you go back to my previous video, 1909, April 17th, one of the most brutal 49-round bouts in boxing history. 38 knockdowns. Joe Jeanette went down 27 times. Sam McVeigh went down 11 times. I have that number 2 as the greatest World Heavyweight Championship bout. It's for the vacant colored heavyweight championship title that was left by Jack Johnson. May 22nd, 19-year-old Les Darcy defeats 24-year-old Jeff Smith on a foul in 2 rounds, Sydney, Australia, to win the Australian recognition as middleweight championship belt. Sydney Stadium, New South Wales, Australia. Tuesday, June 1st, 24-year-old Mike Glover defeats 28-year-old Matt Wells, 12 rounds, Boston, Massachusetts, to win the welterweight championship crown, the Atlas Arena. Referee was Patsy Haynes. June 12th, 19-year-old Les Darcy knocks out 22-year-old Mick King, 10 rounds, Sydney, Australia, to retain the Australian recognition of the middleweight championship and Commonwealth British Empire middleweight championship crown. The referee was Harold Baker. June 21st, 1915, Jack Britton defeats Mike Glover, 12 rounds, Boston, Massachusetts, to win the World Welterweight Championship crown, Atlas Athletic Association Club, Boston, Massachusetts. Mike Glover, his name was Michael J. Carvanaugh. He was born December 18, 1890, Lawrence, Massachusetts. He died July 11, 1917, was 26 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Middleborough, Massachusetts. Stood 5'9", and his total bout career was 93 fights, 62 wins, 16 knockouts, 15 losses. He would have 15 draws, who won no contest. He was a claimant of the welterweight championship belt. 24-year-old Mike Glover held the recognition of the welterweight championship belt with a victory win over 29-year-old Matt Wells, June 1st, 1915, at the Athletic Club. They call it the Atlas Athletic Club. It's in Boston, Massachusetts. 3 weeks later, June 21st, 1915, Glover would lose his welterweight recognition with a loss to Clinton, New Jersey's Jack Britton. Isn't that phenomenal? Now, Glover fought Ted Kid Lewis 3 times. He won once. Defeated European World Featherweight Champion by knockout July 22nd, 1913. He defeated Jack Britton November 27th, 1913. He was winning 10 rounds, newspaper decision, in defense of his claim as champion. June 29th, 1915, Oxnard Cyclone. Sam McVeigh defeats Boston Bone Crusher Sam Langford, 12 rounds, Atlas Athletic Club in Boston, Massachusetts. July 31st, 1915, Les Darcy knocks out Eddie McCarthy, 15 rounds, Sydney, Australia, and remains the Australian recognition of the middleweight champion. Eddie McCarthy, his name was Edward McCarthy. He was born July 31st, 1889, Eureka, Wisconsin. He died November 2nd, 1929 in Wisconsin. He stood 5'10" and a half inches and had a 73-inch reach. He was a middleweight, fought from 1900 to 1922. Had a fighting career record of 96 total bouts, 66 wins, 18 losses, 44 knockouts, and he was stopped 7 times. Was in the ring with fighters such as George Chip. Had a draw with Chip. Mike Gibbons lost with him. Bombardier Billy Wales lost to him. Harry Greb, Sergeant J. Black, Buck Krause, he would defeat him. He would lose to Jeff Smith. He would draw with Frank Klaus, and draw with Chuck Wiggins, and draw with Bud Gorman. These are all very good fighters in their day. August 31st, Ted Kid Lewis defeats Jack Britton in 12 rounds at the Atlas Athletic Club in Boston, Massachusetts. September 10th, 1915, Johnny Ertel defeats Kid Williams, 5 rounds, St. Paul's. Was not recognized, but it was a claim of Bantamweight Championship belt by Johnny Ertel. Now, Kid Williams, his name was Jonathan Gautreau. Was born December 5th, 1893 in Denmark. He died October 18th, 1963. He was 69 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Baltimore, Maryland. He stood 5 foot 1 inch. He was a bantamweight and fought from 1910 to 1929. Total bout career of 130 fights, 100 wins, 19 losses, 50 knockouts, and he was stopped 5 times. He had 8 draws. He would win the IBU Bantamweight Championship crown from 20-year-old Eddie Campy. It was on a Saturday night, January 31st, 1914. 12 rounds, and it would be a beautiful knockout. Both men weighed 116 pounds for that fight. Incredible. 61-5 with 21 knockouts. Eddie Campy was some fighter. Now he would knock out 25-year-old Johnny Colin. June 9th, 1914, 3 rounds at the Vernon Arena. The referee was Charles Eaton. It was to become the world bantamweight champion. And that was a phenomenal fight. June 30th, 1914, he would defeat 18-year-old Pete Herman at the Pelican Stadium in New Orleans. It would be a draw. Pete Herman would become a champion himself. He would lose to Johnny Kilbane, March 17, 1915. It was not for the championship. September 10th, 1915, the referee was George Barton. He would face Johnny Urtel. He would lose in a disqualification in 5 rounds in that auditorium. He would also face Memphis Powell Moore and Frankie Burns. September 27th, 1915, Ted Kid Lewis defeats Jack Britton, 12 rounds, Boston, Massachusetts, at the Athletic Club, remains world welterweight champion. October 18th, 1915, Boston Bone Crusher Sam Langford defeats heavyweight John Lester Johnson, 15 rounds in Denver, Colorado, in defense of his world-colored heavyweight championship belt. October 23rd, 1915, 19-year-old Les Darcy defeats 25-year-old Jimmy Clabby, 20 rounds, Sydney, Australia, to remain Australian recognition of the middleweight championship belt. Referee with Arthur Scott. Fight took place in Sydney Stadium, Sydney, New South Wales. Now, who was Jimmy Clattery? I want to discuss him for one moment. His name was Jimmy Byron Clattery. He was known as the Indian Wasp. I always got a kick out of that name. He was born July 14th, 1890 in Northwich, Connecticut. He died January 19th, 1934. He was 43 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Hammond, Indiana. He stood 5 foot 8 inches. He was a middleweight and fought from 1906 to 1923. He had a fighting career record of 129 total bouts, 80 wins, 21 losses, 45 knockouts, and he was stopped 4 times. He had 23 draws. May 4th, 1915, he defeated world middleweight champion, 20-year-old Al McCoy, and Broadway Sports Club in Brooklyn, New York. Now, that was called the Broadway Arena. They would change that name not too far from Eastern Parkway. And he became the brand new world middleweight champion in 10 rounds. He lost 1 and won 1 to George Chick. Lost 1 and won 1 to Dave Smith. He lost the Australian recognition of the World Middleweight Championship crown to 19-year-old Australian Les Darcy, 20 rounds. He had a record of 33 wins, 4 losses, and 20 knockouts. Incredible, the Les Darcy. Saturday, October 23rd, 1915, the referee was Arthur Scott. Between February 17th, 1917 and April 28th, 1917, he would lose and re-win the Australian Middleweight Championship to Tommy Uren. July 14th, 1917, he would lose the Australian Middleweight Championship to Tommy Uren. Between August 11th, 1917 and January 1st, 1917, Clabby would draw, win, and then lose the Australian Heavyweight Championship belt to Albert Kid Lloyd. Phenomenal career this man would have. Jimmy Clabby. October 26th, World Welterweight Champion Ted Kid Lewis defeats Joe Mata, 12 rounds, Atlas Athletic Club. They call it the Athletic Arena, which is located in Boston, Massachusetts. And that's the hometown of the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford, who was originally from Canada. November 2nd, 1915, World Welterweight Champion Ted Kid Lewis knocks out Merburn Sailor, Silva weighed 135 pounds the day before the fight. And Ted Kid Lewis never weighed in at all. And they still went through with the fight. November 23rd, 1915, 22-year-old Ted Kid Lewis knocks out 26-year-old Lockport Jimmy Duffy, another interesting character. Had a record of 62 wins, 4 losses, 20 draws, 14 knockouts. Boston Arena. December 11th, World Bantamweight champion Kid Williams and Frankie Burns draws for 20 rounds in New Orleans to defend his Bantamweight championship belt. Monday night, December 20th, 23-year-old Mighty Atom, Little Jimmy Wild knocks out 26-year-old Sid Smith and London National Sporting Club at the Covent Gardens, 8 rounds, as referee stops the contest to save Sid Smith from further punishment. It was in defense of his flyweight championship belt. Jimmy Wild, he had a record of 102 fights, 1 loss, 1 draw, 71 knockouts. Sid Smith has 68 wins, 12 losses, 6 draws, and 7 knockouts. I'm sure it was 7 and not 6 knockouts. I guess it's according to the record books that you look at. But in my mind, I have 7 knockouts. Now, here's the thing about that fight. The men would face each other on the scales that same morning of the fight. And Sid Smith weighed in 8 stones, which was 112 and a half pounds, a little bit over the weight. And that was after 2 attempts. He had 1 more shot in order to make the weight. He made it in his second try. Jimmy Wild stepped on the scale with a 3-piece suit on, pocket watch, fedora hat, and wingtip shoes. And he still came in a little bit under 112 pounds, slightly under 8 stones. Jimmy Wild and Ted Kid Lewis performed at the London Music Hall, and they were both musical composers. And like I said, what was amazing about Ted Kid Lewis, he was the first fighter to wear what was called gum shoes or gum shields. We know it as a mouthpiece. So that's going to be the end of this video. 1915. Next video will be 1916 and possibly 1917. I'll try and get 2 decades in that video. This video holds up to 30 minutes or so. But I wanted to get into more detail as the videos go by, because as we get into Benny Leonard and others, there's a lot of reasons for why they fought, what happened with their money, that I want to get into. 1920, the Walker Law. And you had Tony Canzaneri. But you had Johnny Dundee. Johnny Dundee was the first fighter to fight under that Walker Law. And there's details around that. As we get into Jimmy McLaurin and Barney Ross in the 30s, as they swap a 3-fight series back and forth. I've met Jimmy McLaurin. As we get into Battle in Battleino and Fargo Express, a young man, his name is Billy Patrol, called him the Fargo Express, one of the most devastating body punches in boxing history. We're going to get into Henry Armstrong's whole career. 19 title defenses at the welterweight. I mean, incredible career Henry Armstrong would have. Joe Louis. So we get into the 40s. Black Murderers Row and all those outstanding fighters. Lightweights like Bo Jack and Ike Williams. Bob Montgomery. Guy by the name of Enrique Bolanos. I mean, you had some dynamic fighters. Willie Joyce. So we're going to look at all those fighters in the lighter division. We get to the 50s. Kid Gavilan. We're going to talk about his fight with Gil Turner, 1952, Philadelphia. What fight that was. In the 1960s, Benny Kid Paret and Emil Griffith, the 3-fight series. 1970s, the trilogy with Muhammad Ali and Ken Norton, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And all the fights with Ruben Oliveras and Alexis Aguilos in 1980s. Gomez and Sanchez, Duran and Leonard, and Hagler. 90s. all of the good fights that we're going to go through, all the way up into 2000s. We're going to examine every world championship fight. So just follow me on this series. Just be patient with me. By the end of the year, it'll be completely done. Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. 100 years of world championship fights. I'm Scrapbook Boxing. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Shout out to my brother Curtis Anderson. Salute.